This program is brought to you by Grand Valley State University.
Well, good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Gleaves Whitney, Director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. I wish you a warm welcome coming out and joining us this evening. We have a few special guests here, and I would like to point them out. First of all, Ralph Hauenstein, our benefactor. Thank you, Ralph. It was Ralph's vision that makes tonight's program and programs like this possible. There are also a number of other people here. Don Lovers, is he in here? Don, yes, Don? Don is President Emeritus here at Grand Valley State University. We always appreciate your being here with us as well. Also, we have two former senators from Michigan State government. Boy, could Michigan State government use people like Jesse Dahlman and Joanne Emmons. Where are they? And also, I would like to take this opportunity to recognize our cabinet, the Hauenstein Center cabinet. We have several members here this evening. Would you please stand and be recognized for all of your volunteer efforts behind the scenes? Our cabinet? Yes, thank you. Well, did you see the newspapers this morning? We are supposed to have a meteor shower out there in the heavens tonight. But when I read that article, I thought, my word, we're going to have a meteor shower and a light display right here inside in Loosemore auditorium. We're delighted to have our special guest, Herb Meyer, with us this evening. Herb comes to us from the Seattle, Washington area. He's also been in Washington, D.C. for much of his career, so he can speak to both parts of the country. And he is a popular speaker on the lecture circuit. We had the opportunity to hear him last winter in Florida, and we realized that he was very powerful in reaching audiences with a very provocative message. He's delivered his overview of global trends and developments. It's called What in the World is Going On? An intelligent briefing for CEOs to corporations, business associations, student organizations, and public affairs groups throughout the world. We also learned that during lunch about his many stories during the Reagan administration. I hope during question and answer period he will have the opportunity to say a few things about his work in the Reagan administration. He served as special assistant to the Director of Central Intelligence and was vice chairman of the CIA's National Intelligence Council. In these positions, he managed production of the U.S. national intelligence estimates and other top secret projections for the President and his national security advisors. Mr. Meyer is widely credited with being the first U.S. government official, the first, to forecast the Soviet Union's collapse, a forecast for which he later was awarded the U.S. National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. And when he walks up here, you'll see a little ribbon right here on his lapel, and that is that medal. Formerly, he was an associate editor of Fortune, and I learned that he got a grand piano in those days when he was at Fortune. I can tell you off script that he plays Bach and ragtime piano. We almost had him play for us a little bit earlier this evening. And he's also the author of several books, including The War Against Progress, Real World Intelligence, and Hard Thinking. With his wife Jill, they co-authored How to Write, and I have a copy of that, which he and his wife have published together, Storm King Press. And he is also the host and producer of The Siege of Western Civilization, which you no doubt saw on the table out front. He's written a number of essays on intelligence and politics that have been published in the Wall Street Journal, National Review Online, Policy View, and Primus, an American thinker, and we're delighted that he's going to share a wealth of insights into what's going on in the world tonight. Herb Meyer.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gleaves. Thank you for coming this evening, especially those of you who are students here at the university. When I was a college student, I always went to lectures by out-of-town big shots. And I did it for a very specific reason. I wanted to be seen by my instructors and thought to be a more serious student than they had thought I was based on the work I did in class. Usually worked. Every so often it went haywire. I would show up and circulate, make sure I was seen, and just as the lights were going down and the doors were closing, I would realize not a single one of my instructors had showed up. And now I was trapped. I'd given up a perfectly pleasant evening in front of my television set, and now I had to listen while some clown in a suit blathered on about politics or history or economics, and I was stuck learning things. If there are any of you students here following in my undistinguished footsteps, my only piece of advice is learn how to fake a look of intense interest. It comes in handy in life, particularly at job interviews, also on dates. For those of you who are here because you want to get some sense of what's going on in the world, and for those of you who are students, what the world's going to look like when you finish your studies here and jump out into it, let's turn to business. I want to outline 3 of the biggest things happening out there, trends and developments that, in my judgment, will dominate the next several decades. I want to just outline them for you and then loop back over them and talk about where they're going and what it's going to mean. One point before we begin. I've been messing around with all this for a long time now. In the last few years, a trend has developed in our country that's unhealthy. We argue before we understand. Not a good thing to do. When there are complicated and contentious issues, honorable people will disagree about what to do, and that's fine. That's how we figure out our way forward. Intelligent people should be able to reach a common understanding of what the problem is before we start yelling and screaming about it, and we've lost that ability. It's a shouting match. Watch any of the talk shows, even when I'm on them. It's a shouting match. Look at any of our political campaigns. Let's not do that tonight. I've left my politics at home. I hope you have too. If you want to know what I think we should do about this, buy me a beer some evening. I will be happy to tell you in great detail. Let's leave all the partisan stuff away. If we can reach an understanding of what's happening and what it's going to mean to us, we'll have accomplished a lot, and that's what I'd like to try and do. When you look at the world out there, the first thing you find yourself looking at right now is the war. And of all the issues, this is the most contentious. Some people think President Bush did a terrific job. Other people think he made a god-awful mess of it. That's another conversation for another time and place. What's important is to understand what the war is about, because that may give us an understanding of where it is, and more importantly, where it's going, what's likely to happen next. To understand what the war is about, press the rewind button. Go all the way back into history. When you do that, you'll see that history is the story of competing operating systems. There's one thing we all understand, it's competing operating systems. When operating systems collide in the marketplace, things get very nasty very quickly, technically and legally. The technical people work out patches and fixes. The legal people work out cross-licensing agreements. Consumers sort through what they like and what they don't like. Life goes on. Microsoft has a lot of money. It hasn't got tanks. If Bill Gates had tanks, Apple's corporate headquarters would look like a building in Beirut. In politics, there really are tanks. And when one operating system sets out to impose itself on another operating system, that's war. That's the definition of a war. Our operating system is Western civilization. This is who we are. Western civilization started with the Greeks, but it took off in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries when Judaism and Christianity reconciled with the modern world. The rabbis, the priests, the scholars, they figured it out. They paved the way forward. That triggered the scientific revolution itself. It ignited the greatest explosion of art, literature, and music the world's ever known. Shakespeare, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Bach. When you stand back from it, here's what Western civilization is. The individual is at the center of it. Church and state are separate. It's the rule of law, the idea of property rights, economic liberty, individual rights, human rights, women's rights. In Western civilization, we unleash the entrepreneurial talents of our people. We encourage intellectual curiosity. It's an endless struggle for equality among the races and the sexes. Is Western civilization perfect? No, couldn't be. It's designed and operated by human beings. We make mistakes. But when all is said and done, Western civilization is history's most extraordinary accomplishment. It's the modern world. In just the last century, there have been two efforts by other operating systems to knock us off. The first was fascism, World War II. If Hitler and the Nazis, Mussolini in Italy, the Japanese warlords, if they had been content to impose that miserable operating system only on their own people, would have been ghastly for their own people, but you wouldn't have had World War II. It's only when they come after you. Same thing happened in the Cold War, and that was the Kremlin's effort to impose the Soviet communist operating system on everybody else. And same point. If they'd been content to impose it on their own people, too bad, but you wouldn't have had a Cold War. It's only when they come after you. Stand back from history. There's one more operating system that's been out there a long time, and that's Islam. The reason you can describe Islam as an operating system is that all too often in Islam, church and state are combined. They don't have that separation. Islam is a political structure as well as a faith. The individual is subservient to the church-state combination, and by and large, you don't have the option to opt out. Islam does not unleash the entrepreneurial talents of its people. It discourages intellectual curiosity. By the way, that's why there hasn't been a scientific breakthrough from the Islamic world in 1,000 years. This is one of the tragedies of human history. The Muslims are geniuses. They invented algebra. It's an Arabic word. They virtually invented the science of medicine. In every field of science and technology, they were the world's leaders, and then everything stopped. There's no other example in history of that happening. But if you spend 1,000 years crushing intellectual curiosity and slaughtering your geniuses, you won't get new technology, you won't get new science. The great tragedy is we have no way of knowing what we might have known if they hadn't done that. There's one other feature of that operating system that's relevant. All too often, it treats women as though they were property rather than people. And very simply put, that operating system is incompatible with the modern world. And that's the glitch. This is what Pope Benedict was talking about when he gave that famous speech in Regensburg about 3 years ago. If you remember the speech he gave, it just exploded across the world. Whatever your faith, whether you have faith or not, this Pope has more neurons firing than any 10 of us put together. He's absolutely brilliant. What he was saying in Regensburg is this: when you look at the history of Western civilization, it's obvious we've made horrific mistakes. But over the centuries, we've learned to temper faith with reason. We've found our way forward. What you're telling us, he said to the Muslim world he was talking to in that speech, is that the Quran is the unalterable Word of God. Now, the Quran is a beautiful book. There are passages in the Quran every bit as marvelous as anything in the Old Testament or the New Testament. But there are passages in the Quran that say very clearly, very unambiguously, convert the infidel or kill him. And what the Pope was asking in that speech, and he talked in that circumlocucious way that popes talk, is, do we have a problem? If that's unalterable and it says kill us, how do we live together? Boy, did he ask the right question. He went to the heart of the issue in a way that no political leader had the brains or the guts to do. That's why that Regensburg speech exploded across the globe. Now, human nature doesn't change. Anywhere you go, the overwhelming majority of people are perfectly moderate, decent people. They're raising their kids, they're going to school, they're doing their jobs. They don't want to cause trouble. They just want to be left alone to live quietly. Most Germans weren't Nazis. In the Cold War years, most Russians weren't communists. The overwhelming majority of Muslim people are absolutely marvelous, wonderful people. You'd be lucky to have them as your neighbors. But when the radicals are in charge, Islam attacks the West. That's what happened in the 7th and 8th centuries. Islam attacked the West, took over Spain, France, North Africa. Anybody see the movie El Cid with Charlton Heston? Deals with some of that. I got to know Charlton Heston. He was one of President Reagan's buddies, and the president liked to invite his Hollywood friends to visit him at the White House. They'd sit around, they'd have a couple of drinks, they'd swap stories. That's how the president liked to relax. Reagan being Reagan, he used to say, the bad news is that there were so few conservatives in Hollywood The good news is 1 out of 3 gets to be president. And he was the one, Heston was one of the 2 losers. Islam attacked the second time in the 16th and 17th centuries. By 1683, they had reached the gates of Vienna. It was right outside Vienna in 1683 that the climactic battle took place between Islam and the West. The West won. We've been going forward ever since. Islam lost. Do any of you happen to know the date of the climax of the battle outside Vienna in 1683 between Islam and the West? September 11th. Right. Isn't that interesting? Next time you're wondering why you're studying history, that's why. On September 10, 2001, there wasn't one member of the Bush administration who had a clue that the next day was a crucial day in the history of Islam, and they should have known it. That's what we pay them for. What we're seeing now, what we call the war on terrorism or overseas contingency operations, is actually the 3rd attack on Western civilization by radical Islam. Terrorism's a tactic. And the lesson of 9/11 is this. We live in a world in which a small number of people can kill a large number of people very quickly. That's what's new and that's what's different. They can hijack airplanes and fly them into buildings. If they pour botulism into the Grand Rapids water supply, you can kill 50, 60, 70,000 people overnight. If they get their hands on a nuclear device, and they might, they can take out Dallas or Chicago, Rome, Paris. If something goes wrong, it goes wrong really fast. And remember, when you play defense, you have to win 100% of the time. And you can't. If we had the world's greatest intelligence service, let's say it could stop 25 out of 26 terrorist attacks. That's very good, except you're dead. 26th attack got you. When you play defense, you're going to lose. The only question is whether you lose sooner or later or much later. So what do you do? And this was the jam that President Bush was in after 9/11. Keep playing defense, you get hit again. No one was crazy enough to say, well, let's just go turn everything into molten glass. You know, nuke the Mideast. That's crazy. He had to do something between the 2 extremes. What the administration set out to do was this. Not to impose our operating system on them. What we wanted was for Islam to do what Judaism and Christianity had done centuries ago. Reconcile with the modern world. Join us in the 21st century. In effect, develop version 2.0. They could do that. The level of violence would drop. We'd all be a lot safer. That was the idea. The strategy for accomplishing that was to use our military power to knock out the radicals and give the moderates a chance to hold power. In some cases, the first chance they'd had in years, in other cases, decades, and in some cases, centuries. Remember, the moderates are the overwhelming majority, because they're always the overwhelming majority. If they could get a grip on power and hold it, they might be able to reconcile their faith with modernity. Now, when you look back over all these years we've been through, all the yelling and screaming, most of it about Iraq, was over our execution of that strategy. And fair enough, I don't know anyone who thinks it was perfect or close to perfect. What happened is this. The whole objective of the war dropped out of the national conversation. Everybody started yelling and screaming about Iraq, and fair enough. But everyone lost track of what are we trying to do in the first place. I'll come back to this in a few minutes, and I'll show you where things are right now, what's likely to happen next. But the point is this. When you look at the war, watch it on TV, argue about it, you're looking at an effort to shift 1.5 billion people from the 8th century into the 21st century fast. Anybody who thought you could do that easily without making mistakes or quickly is not being realistic. This war will dominate the rest of your lives. While that's going on over there, there's a transformation taking place in our own part of the world whose impact on our country, on our economy, on your lives will be even greater. Our part of the world is Western civilization, the modern world. What's happening right now in the modern world is something no one had anticipated. We've stopped breeding, literally. Here are the numbers. If you want to keep a steady population in a country, the birth rate has to be 2.1. 2.1 births per woman. You need the 2 births just to replace the mother and father. Then you need 0.1. Some children don't live, don't grow up, and have their own children. So 2.1 is the key number. Today in Western Europe, the birth rate's 1.5. It's 30% below replacement. What that means is that by the time those of you who are students now are my age, the population of Western Europe will have dropped by 70 to 80 million Europeans. That's the biggest, fastest population drop in recorded history. The birth rate in Germany right now is 1.3. Ask a German teenager, how many cousins have you got? The kid says, what's a cousin? If you have one child and the child grows up and marries someone who's also an only child, and then they have one child, there's no aunt, there's no uncle, there's no cousin. In Germany today, 30% of all women are childless. And among college-educated German women, 40% are childless. That's shut down. It means the population is actually dropping. The number of deaths vastly exceeds the number of births. Empty apartments, empty condos, empty houses. The two countries in Western Europe with the lowest birth rates are Italy and Spain. 1.2 trending down to 1.1. With a 1.2 birth rate, in 20 years, you lose 30% of your entire working age population. Take 30% of the working age population out of Grand Rapids, where's the economy? Who's in the schools? Who's in the restaurants? Who's at the malls? Who's buying the products and services the companies are selling? Where's the workforce? You're dead. And this is what's happening now. It turns out, also to everyone's astonishment, there's a powerful correlation between faith and kids. People of faith tend to lead traditional lives. Grow up, settle down, get married, have a family. Europe has lost its faith. Europe describes itself as a secular post-Judeo-Christian civilization. That's their phrase for it, not mine. It's a polite way of saying the churches are empty except for a few old ladies and American tourists. If your whole population thinks there's nothing there, just a collection of molecules held together by gravity, at some point we activate it, at some point we'll deactivate, no. Nobody's going to fight for anything. Why? You make yourself comfortable. It's a lot more fun to sit at a cafe or go skiing on the weekend than it is to stay up all night with a sick kid. So they stopped having kids. They also stopped getting married. Today in Europe, only 1 out of 7 couples gets married. Marriage is pretty much over. In England in 2008, the total number of marriages was lower than the total number of marriages in England in 1895. They don't like having kids. They don't like getting married. They don't like working either. Today, the average European gets an additional 450 hours per year vacation versus an American. That's 10.5 weeks. Give every American worker an additional 10.5 weeks vacation, the economy drops dead. The gap with Scandinavia is now 17 weeks. Statistically, 1 out of 5 working-age Swedes is on permanent disability insurance, which is odd because they look healthy to me. There's a young woman in Stockholm. She looks like she could be on the Swedish Olympic gymnastics team. She claims to be allergic to electricity and therefore cannot be employed anywhere electric power is used. So she applied for permanent disability insurance and she got it. This is crazy. In the modern world, there's a deal. Don't laugh, you're being culturally insensitive, which may be a crime. There's a deal in the modern world. The modern state is a welfare state. And I mean that in a non-political sense of the word. The modern state has an obligation to its people, to the young, to the disadvantaged, to the poor, to the sick, to the elderly. We can argue over how to do it as Republicans versus Democrats, or in France, Gaulists versus Socialists, or in England, Labour versus Conservative, but everyone accepts the idea that, of course, the modern state has an obligation to its people. Boy, is that expensive. Well, where do you get the money from? Taxpayers. Well, where do you get taxpayers from? Kids. They grow up, they become taxpayers. That's how it works. Now, we used to understand this. When we were agricultural societies, everybody knew you need a lot of kids, got to work the farm. Then we became industrial and then post-industrial societies, and everybody said, oh, we don't need that anymore. Yes, you do. You actually need more kids than you ever needed. I'll show you why. I was talking at a group about this and wound up talking with a young lady, and she has one sister. So their parents produced 2 children to take care of two aging adults. Take care of in the sense of work, generate the tax revenue from Medicare, Social Security, everything, including the little buses that run senior people around to shopping malls and movie matinees, and just generate all the wealth. And take care of them literally. Drive to the house on Saturday, have lunch with them, run them over to the dentist, things you do with aging parents. This young woman has a partner, not a husband, a partner, and they don't plan to have children. Her sister is married, has one child, doesn't plan to have any more. So these four people produced one child to take care of them. Do you realize the tax burden on that one kid? It's crushing. And by the way, those four are going to live longer, and no matter what health care plan we adopt, the cost of health care isn't going to drop. Do the math. When you go from 2 or 3 kids to take care of 2 parents to 1 to take care of 4, your economy collapses. And that's what's happened in Europe. They forgot to do the math. Well, if you forget to do the math, but you want to keep the machine going, you've only got one choice. You import people. Who are they importing? Muslims. Today, the Muslim population of countries like France and Germany is 10%, and rising fast. They've got the higher birth rates. By the way, that 10% is the correct number, but it's misleading. The Muslim population of France is now 10%. When you look at the population of France under the age of 20, Muslims are now 30% of the total. I went to grad school in Paris. It wasn't 30%. I doubt it was even 1%. The problem is that these Muslims are not being integrated into European society. The Europeans believe very deeply in multiculturalism. Now, there's a word you hear a lot, especially if you have kids in schools. Have you noticed no one ever defines that word? When all the intellectuals and talking heads use a big fancy word, get the definition. The technical definition of multiculturalism is people of different faiths and cultures are permitted to settle without being required to integrate. So the Muslims in Europe are settling but not integrating. To give you a sense of how separate they are physically, when you travel through Europe, all the major cities, Paris, Hamburg, Rome, Marseille, are literally ringed by housing developments, villages and towns that are entirely Muslim. The police won't go there. They call them no-go zones. With all the car burnings in France, that's what you're beginning to see boil over. To give you a sense of how separate these communities are culturally, today, the fastest rising crime on the continent of Europe is a father killing his daughter. These honor killings. About 6 years ago in Norway, the country's leading poet was a 27-year-old woman, 3rd generation, born in Oslo, but Turkish. She announced her engagement to a Norwegian oil engineer, kind of engagement you see in the style section of the Sunday papers. Her father and 5 brothers killed her. She's Norway's leading poet. These honor killings have spread throughout Europe. They're happening routinely now in Canada. We've had 1 in Atlanta and 2 in Dallas. The whole effort to integrate is going backwards rather than forwards. In England, last year, the City of Manchester School Board suddenly noticed they're missing 3,000 girls. They're just not there. The enrollment of girls freshman to sophomore year dropped 3,000. They have no idea what happened. They're just not there. Whether they've been removed from school, sent off on marriages, or done away with, they don't know. Another example of how it's going backwards. England has a nationalized healthcare system, and with all the fussing over our healthcare system, we're beginning to notice that and study it. The British healthcare system is very heavily staffed by Muslim nurses and doctors. They're very highly trained. They're very competent. 9 months ago, the association that represents women Muslim nurses and doctors in the UK announced that from now on, they will no longer scrub before surgery. Immoral to bare their arms to their elbows. These are not immigrants who just got off the boat. These are doctors. When the most educated people in your society check out of the 21st century, you're going backwards. And you can see this playing out politically. Now, the Europeans tend not to like American presidents. They didn't like Jerry Ford, great guy though he was. Reagan was an amiable idiot. They couldn't stand George W. Bush. He was the smirking Texas gunslinger, Bible-thumping, knuckle-dragging moron chimp. They very much like President Obama. And the president went there a couple of months ago, and he asked the Europeans for help. He said, look, would you help us out in Afghanistan? And they told him to take a flying jump. And he said, look, all of our economies are in recession. We have to come up with these stimulus packages. We'd like you to do the same thing. Europeans told him to get lost. It wasn't Bush. It wasn't Obama. It's Europe. They're not going to help us out on the war, because to get elected in Europe, you need the support of the Muslim voters, and they're not going to back us. They're not going to come up with a stimulus package to offload the debt onto the next generation, because they haven't got a next generation. What you're seeing in Europe is a demographic death spiral. And the gap between the United States and Europe is widening very fast now. Same thing's happening in Japan. The birth rate in Japan is 1.3, about the same as Germany, going down a little bit. What that means is 30 years from now, the population of Japan will drop by 50 to 60 million Japanese people. That's catastrophic. Now, Japan's a different place. If you know Japan, they're not bringing in 50 million Koreans to run it, or 50 million Turks. They're shutting it down. In Japan, they've already closed 2,000 schools, K through 12. They're now closing schools in Japan at a rate of 300 school closings every year. They plan to continue closing 300 schools a year as far ahead as they can see. They've already closed 2 universities. They're on the verge of closing a 3rd. Now they're talking about combining prefectures, which is their states. That's shutdown. What happens is this. When your birth rate drops below that 2.1 replacement level, your whole population is aging because you don't have enough young people to replace the older people. Japan is aging so fast that by 2020, 1 out of every 5 Japanese citizens will be over the age of 70. How you run a modern society like that, no one has any idea. The only thing they've come up with is this. At the age of 65, they will ship every Japanese citizen to the Philippines, where they have lots of young people who work cheap to take care of them. That's the plan. Now look, Europe and Japan are 2 of the world's great cultures. They're also 2 of the world's economic engines. And if they're shutting down, that's serious. Here in North America, the picture's different. It's a little mixed. Our friends to the north in Canada now have a birth rate of 1.5, right in the middle of the European average. We are too polite to say this out loud, but Canada is now a European country in North America. Here in the United States, you will be pleased to hear, with the exception of tiny New Zealand, we are the only country in the West bucking the trend. For 30 years, the U.S. birth rate was stuck at 2, just below the 2.1 replacement level. So for 30 years, we were going in the same direction as everybody else, but not at the same rate, a more shallow glide path down. In 2008, for the first time in 30 years, we hit the 2.1 replacement level. Nobody's quite sure why. Sometimes you get an uptick of a tenth or a downtick of 0.2 of a point. Doesn't mean anything. One obvious explanation is this. If you break out the U.S. birth rate ethnically, in 2008, the Anglo birth rate in the U.S. was 1.8. The Hispanic birth rate in the U.S. was 3.2. That's probably why we hit it. Remember I said there's a correlation between faith and kids? You can really see this playing out. If you take the famous red-blue political map, red is Republican, blue is Democrat, in the 2004 presidential election, I've not seen the numbers yet for the 2008 election. In the 2004 election, in states that voted for George W. Bush, the birth rate is 12% higher than in states that voted for John Kerry. That's a gigantic difference. You can even see this at the local level. If you take 2 American cities of approximately the same size and economic prosperity, Seattle and Salt Lake City, in ultra-liberal Seattle, not far from where I live now, dogs now outnumber children by 45%. And they're closing schools. It gets real nasty when you close schools. In Salt Lake City, kids outnumber dogs by 19%. They're building schools. You know, when you're in the television talking head business, you get to meet the other talking heads in the makeup rooms before you go on camera, going out for a cup of coffee when the show's over. Have you noticed when you watch all these talk shows, particularly on Fox, we have what appears to be an inexhaustible supply of blonde political strategists. For the life of me, I can't figure out what they do with the rest of the day. They're all blonde and they all have teeth like chiclets. Off camera, when you're talking to the blonde political strategists with teeth like chiclets who are Democrats, they're actually worried. The base is dying. In cities like Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, population is aging and declining, just like Europe. Off camera, The blonde political strategists with teeth like chiclets who were Republicans are actually optimistic. That's where the tax revenues are flowing. That's where the families are growing. That's where the churches and synagogues are going up, where the schools are being built. And here's how this plays out politically. About 8 weeks ago, in the midst of this terrible economic recession, 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon when no one's looking, the White House announced that they're giving control of the 2010 census from the Census Bureau and the Commerce Department, which is where it lives, to Rahm Emanuel in the White House. And everybody went, what? What are you doing that for? Real simple. If you let the 2010 census just go, these birth rate numbers are so powerful that Congress could flip Republican. And that's what they're trying to stop. The fault line in politics, not just here in the United States, all through the West, is this whole issue of faith and family. It's not a fight over whether the tax rate should be 18% or 14.6%. And no one saw that coming. This whole issue of faith, family, children is the fault line in Western politics. By the way, every statistic I've given you this evening is an official number. These are all World Health Organization numbers, government numbers. That's the United Nations. I didn't make these up. There is no alternate set of birth rate numbers. Everybody's using the same numbers. You just count. You can argue over what the numbers mean, but we've all got the same numbers. There is no other set of numbers. If we spent a week going to colleges, universities, high schools, all over the United States, how many instructors do you think will find teaching that all through the West birth rates are imploding? Not many. What most students learn today is that world population is spinning out of control. It isn't true. It hasn't been true for 30 years, and everybody knows it because we're all using the same numbers. That's ideology infecting education. That's people teaching that the worst thing that ever happened to planet Earth is humanity. We pollute, we use resources. You teach that to children for 15 years, and a lot of them grow up, they think bringing a baby into the world is committing a hostile act against the planet. Surprise! Birth rates drop. Here are the overall numbers. Our birth rates are way below the replacement rate. The Muslim countries all have birth rates above the 2.1 replacement level. They go from about 2.4 to 6.8. They're very, very violent. So world population is continuing to increase, but it's decelerating very fast now because we're pulling it down, and even their birth rates are starting to drop. What it means is this. According to the United Nations, over your lifetimes, over the next 30, 40, 50 years, world population will top out and then begin to go down. Those are the official United Nations numbers. That's what's actually happening. We're just getting to the peak of it now, and then it starts to go down. There's an interesting trend inside the numbers. We're living longer but having fewer children. So world population's aging. Now it's aging at different rates in different places. In Japan, it's aging catastrophically. In England, by 2032, 1 out of every 4 citizens is over the age of 65. How the other 3 are going to support them, we have no idea. But it's aging. According to the United Nations, we actually cross the line in 2045. And what it means is this. By the time you're my age, for the first time in recorded history, the number of humans over the age of 55 will be larger than the number of humans under the age of 15. This has never happened in recorded history. Remember, we're moving toward this every year. It's not that the switch gets flipped. But by 2045, it's over. Never in history have there been more older people than younger people. Who's going to mow your lawn? Who's going to help you carry groceries from the checkout counter to the car? Oh, by the way, who's going to defend you? You're going to have an army. This is unprecedented in world history, and it will dominate your life. There's a third thing happening, and a much more optimistic one. Stand back from all the politics. Get yourself up to an altitude of about 90,000 feet, sort of in a space shuttle, looking out the window at planet Earth so you can see the whole thing. Here's what you see. Never in history have so many human beings emerged so swiftly from poverty. By 1980 or 1990, about 2 billion human beings had come out of poverty. Since then, about another 500 million have come out of poverty, mostly in China and India. And as they come out of poverty, they're pulling people out of poverty all over the world because of the demand for raw materials, goods and services. For example, Latin America is politically volatile in places, but economically, Latin America is growing at an annual rate of over 4%. That's very good. Africa has its disasters. Rwanda a few years ago, Darfur now. It's a genocide and no one's lifting a finger to stop it. But today on the African continent, there are now 17 countries whose annual economic growth rates consistently exceed 4%. That's fantastic. Put all the numbers together and here's what you've got. Each year, between 50 million and 100 million human beings have been emerging from poverty. The low estimate's 50, the high estimate's 100. I think it's been closer to the high estimate, but those are the two estimates that fit. With the worldwide economic recession, I assume it's going to be lower than that. Maybe it's 30, 40, 50, 60 million a year emerging from poverty. What that means is this. If we can sustain this trend, maybe pick it up a little bit if we can come out of the recession, within your lifetimes, the majority of human beings will be middle class. That's the biggest change of life on Earth that's ever happened. And it's happening right now, and it's the world's biggest underreported story. The world isn't getting poor, it's getting rich. By the way, you can see it. You go off on a business trip or a vacation, you go to some country, you can't even pronounce the name of the capital. And you get to your hotel, you go up to the room, you push back the curtains, you look out the window, there's traffic on the streets, a Starbucks down the road. You lean out over the window, there's a shopping mall down the street. And when did that happen? The answer is in the last 25, 30 years. It's happening because we figured this out. We've cracked the code. We know how to bring people out of poverty. It's the free enterprise system. Property rights, the rule of law, reasonable taxation, reasonable regulation. You put these elements of the free market economy into place, and boom, people come flying out of poverty. Everybody knows this. You know, you want to be physically fit, eat sensibly, get a lot of exercise. I mean, everybody knows that. There's no one way to do it, but everybody knows that's how you do it. What everybody around the world knows now. If you want to bring your country out of poverty fast, massively, it's the free enterprise system. And what you've seen around the world now are more and more countries putting in place elements of the free market economy, and their people are coming out of poverty. As a practical matter, you cannot bring 3, 4, 5 billion people out of poverty with everybody designing software. The world doesn't work like that. You need stuff. You need roads, factories, houses, whole new cities, shopping centers, schools, universities, medical centers. What you're seeing out there when you travel the world is the greatest burst of industrialization in recorded history. As India, China, and all these other countries build the infrastructure to create a middle-class society. And you're seeing something the world's never seen before, the emergence of a global middle class. You need energy. Energy is to a modernizing economy what blood is to a body. A child's body has 3 to 4 quarts of blood. An adult's body is bigger, it has 5 to 6 quarts. What's driven energy prices up, and what will drive them up again, isn't rich guys jumping in their SUVs and driving to the country club. It's the world coming out of poverty and the creation of a global middle class. You can no sooner tell a society emerging into the middle class to use less energy than you can tell a teenager to eat less food. You don't say, go lie down for a while, you won't be hungry. Body's growing, you need it. That's what's pushed up energy prices. It's also pushed up food prices. In the last 8 years, meat consumption in China has more than doubled. It's a lot of cows and pigs. What do they eat? Corn. So corn prices have gone through the roof. Now, these are problems when energy prices and food prices get out of whack, and it's a serious problem. But what you have to realize is it's a reflection of a gigantic global middle class. All through history, year in, year out, very quietly, a couple of 100 million people would die of starvation. Now they're buying food. That's good. Bad news is prices are high. Good news is they're not starving. This is the single biggest fact of life on Earth, that the world is getting rich, not poor. It's good for several reasons. First, it's a lot of human beings not starving to death. That's great. The second reason it's good is this. It means the total customer base for every product and service we Americans can provide is now growing at a rate of 50 to 100 million new customers every year. That's where your jobs are going to come from. We're going to export. That's why exports have been going up over 20% a year. All these customers are out there. They want everything we can think of to sell to them. Give you an example of how this works. Do you know the company Great Clips? Wonderful people. They operate barber shops and malls. So they're always looking for a new mall because they can get a barber shop in. If they find out there's a new mall going up around Grand Rapids, they get excited. They can get a barber shop in the mall. They found out a couple of years ago there are now 117 shopping malls in Nigeria. What? That's the last time I was there. Last time I was there, super secret trip with the CIA director, with Bill Casey. By the way, everything you've read in the spy books is wrong. They talk about his unmarked black C-130 Starlifter. It's nonsense. It was gray, it wasn't black. We got to Lagos about 1 o'clock in the morning. The situation was so bad, rebels and all this stuff, that his security force had to wake up the off-duty Marine guards at the embassy, say, would you guys come out to the airport with your guns and protect the plane? The rebels were draining the fuel out of every plane that landed at the Lagos airport. And if you landed at the Lagos airport, you grew old in Lagos, you couldn't get off the ground. And you couldn't purchase fuel at the Lagos airport. Nigeria is about the world's 4th largest energy producer. You couldn't buy jet fuel at the airport. So you stopped. So we had to get the guys to come out with their guns and guard the planes while we did what we were doing in Lagos and got out of it. That's how bad it was. Now they got 117 shopping malls. That's a middle class. You ever order something by telephone? You know, the call goes sometimes from here to India or to the Philippines. What you may not realize is very often now it goes from India or the Philippines to Nairobi, Kenya. The world's largest call center is called KenCall. It's in Nairobi. And you have a call center and there are jobs for people like you. And they've got offices and headphones and computers and cars, and they leave work and they want to go to the shopping mall and pick up their kids at daycare and go home and turn on a 42-inch flat screen TV, and boom, you got a middle class. This growing global middle class is what will create the jobs for you all through your lives. There's one final reason. This is very good news. We middle class societies are boring. That's good. All we want to do is drop the kids off at school, do a day's work, come home, see if the kid got into the college they applied to, see if Netflix delivered whatever movie we were waiting for, go to a lecture, watch some TV. Just want to live. Last thing a middle-class society wants is a war. And you're heading into a world in which the majority of human beings, for the first time in history, will be middle class. Boy, is that a different world. Now, let's take a fast loop back over these subjects, see what's going on and where it's going. The war. In some ways, the war is going very well. In Iraq, we've won. Now, we could spend all night arguing over whether we should have gone in the first place. That's a whole different subject. We could spend a week arguing about all the mistakes we made once we did go in. I'm simply reporting to you, we've done it. Iraq is now a functioning democracy that isn't threatening anybody. Whether you're for it or against it isn't the point. It's an extraordinary achievement by the troops. By the way, it's the only second one in the Mideast. The other one's Israel. The extent to which normal life is returning in Iraq is staggering. The oil's flowing, the schools are back in business, the electricity's getting turned back on, they got shopping malls. Go up to the northern parts of Iraq, they're building huge tracts of middle-class housing. The Baghdad School of Music and Ballet is open again. You want to get your kid there for dance lessons or piano lessons, you're on a waiting list. The extent to which normal life is returning is just beyond belief. The problem is this. Do you ever see a racehorse stumble 10 yards before the finish line? Horse is going toward the finish line, everything's great, then it falls. Doesn't happen often, but it happens. Something could still go wrong. Not quite over yet. There could be a horrific bombing, political assassination, and the whole thing blows sky high. It probably won't happen. Racehorses usually don't fall just before the finish line, but it might. And if something goes wrong, then the president's in a real jam. He didn't want to be there in the first place. And that's his privilege entirely. A lot of people agree with him. Now it's his racehorse. And if something goes wrong, he's got a decision to make. He can say, I told you. Or he could throw in the firepower to win it and push that horse over the line. Tough call. Hope he doesn't have to make the decision. He probably won't. We'll be out of there by the end of 2011. And it will actually have turned out to be a success. Whether you're for it or against it, that's another argument. But it's a functioning, stable democracy. It's not threatening anybody. What an achievement. That's beginning to flow through the Mideast. People see that. They like it. Hey, they're voting. The Baghdad Kiwanis Club meets every Thursday now. I mean, normal life's returning. A couple of months ago in Lebanon, they had elections. Everybody thought the bad guys were going to win, Hezbollah. They got creamed. The good guys won. So stability is some good signs. Probably the best thing happening in the entire war is that for the first time now, there is a global reform Muslim movement. Men and women, professionals like yourselves, religious leaders, scholars, they're meeting and they're talking about how to reconcile their faith with modernity. This is the conversation in the Mideast when people get together for dinner at the universities, on the radio talk shows, in the newspapers, on television. They're asking questions like, hey, we haven't had a scientific breakthrough in 1,000 years. How could that be the Israelis' fault? The only new technology we've contributed is the improvised explosive device. Not very neat, you know? And if some idiot wants to set one off, he's got to get a cell phone from the West to do it. Is that the Americans' fault? We're treating half our people like dogs, meaning the women. Whose fault is that? For the first time now, they're looking within and saying, wait a minute, where'd this thing go off the rails? This effort by them to reconcile their faith with modernity is what we wanted to happen. It's actually happening. It doesn't get into the newspapers. It's happening. Where it goes, nobody knows. We haven't got a crystal ball. But you couldn't have that conversation before everything started. If you opened your mouth, they shot you. And they wiped out your third cousins. And now this is the conversation in the Mideast. What an extraordinary and very hopeful development. Remember I told you about the Pope's Regensburg speech? If you remember when he gave that speech, everybody came down on the poor guy. 81-year-old German Rottweiler, doesn't know what he's doing. Boy, did he know what he was doing. After the fuss died down and no one was looking anymore, 138 Islamic religious leaders got together. They wrote an open letter to the Vatican saying, okay, let's talk. Wow. That conversation between the Vatican and Islam opened in Rome on November 4, 2008. By sheer coincidence, our election day. Which is why you didn't hear about it, because that blew everything off the headline. My guess is that if November 4, 2008 is remembered by history 1,000 years from now, it may be because that's the day the conversation opened in Rome between Islam and the West. And by the way, this guy's 81. I imagine his day job keeps him busy. In the middle of all that, he put himself at the center of the conversation between Islam and Western civilization at an intellectual level no one else could touch. What an extraordinary act of global leadership. So there's a lot of good stuff happening. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad stuff happening. Afghanistan, we're losing. You see that on the news. The president's got to decide what to do. It's worse next door in Pakistan. Pakistan's coming completely unglued. Here's what's happening. Over the last several years, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban established a base in Pakistan. They're trying to do to Pakistan what they did years ago to Afghanistan, destabilize it and take it over. They're doing it for one very simple reason. Pakistan's got nuclear bombs. And if they destabilize Pakistan, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban have got the nukes. That's what this is about. It's a raw fight for who gets Pakistan's nuclear bombs. We had been relying on Musharraf to not let that happen, and he wasn't getting it done. So some genius in Washington had the bright idea to send Benazir Bhutto into the middle of all this. She'd been the prime minister twice. And the idea was if you could kind of get the two of them working together, kind of a shotgun political marriage, maybe they could get control of it. Well, it ended catastrophically. She was assassinated. Now the place is falling apart. Right now, the U.S. Army has what we call snatch teams. They're poised around Pakistan's borders, and they have one order. If it all goes to hell, just go in and grab the nukes. Yikes. When you're down to, we have snatch teams to grab the nukes, boy, you're in trouble. Where are they, how many, and how much time have we got? We don't know the answer to these questions. One reason we don't know the answer to the questions, and one reason Musharraf couldn't get a grip on it, is there are units of the Army and the Intelligence Service, the ISI, that are working with the Taliban. So what you've got here is a collapsing nuclear power. And we're in the middle of a raw fight for who gets the nukes. And it may be out of control. This is absolutely terrifying. And if you keep going next door, you get to the big one, and that's Iran. This is the classic case of nuts with nukes. This is terrifying. The problem isn't the weapon. China and France could destroy Grand Rapids tonight. No one's lost a second's sleep over it. It ain't going to happen. Whatever our differences with China and France, they're not destroying Grand Rapids or Los Angeles and New York. It's not going to happen. They're not nuts. In the Cold War, we used to say the Russians are bastards, but they're not crazy bastards. You could deal with them. They don't want to lose Moscow. The people who run Iran, Ahmadinejad and the mullahs, are talking openly of building nuclear bombs and using them, of trading their cities and populations for ours. In other words, giving up Tehran for Tel Aviv, New York, maybe Chicago, and Los Angeles. That puts you in the nut category. Let me tell you something. There are two great lessons of the 20th century. The first is crazy people sometimes get political power. Hitler was crazy. It's brilliant. Kanye was crazy. So is Idi Amin in Uganda. The maniacs who took over Cambodia slaughtered 2.5 million people. Crazy people get power. The second great lesson is this. When crazy people get political power and tell you what they're going to do with it, and it's one of the oddities of politics that crazy people with power tell you precisely what they're going to do. Believe it. That's the lesson of the 20th century. And of all the people who've learned it, it's the Israelis. As late as 1937-38, there were Jewish families who had stayed in Germany. They could have gotten out, but they decided to stay. They owned businesses. They were professors. They were professionals, lawyers, doctors, architects. They had beautiful homes, season tickets to the Berlin Philharmonic. And they watched the Nazis come to power. And they said, look, this is distasteful, and this guy's a little bit nuts, but what are they going to do, kill us all? Yeah, as a matter of fact, exactly what they did. That's the lesson of the 20th century. They mean it. You now have Iran that virtually has a nuclear bomb. Look, I used to do this for a living. They got the bomb, okay? But they'll have it by next Thursday. They're there. And they're talking about using it. Boy, is that dangerous. Everybody I know tells me the Israelis are going to launch. We'll see. I'm a little more skeptical about that. But everyone I know says they're going to launch. But we're coming to a head on this. Either they do something soon or you lose the option to do it. But you have the classic case of crazy people with nuclear bombs. The point I'm making is this. There are good things in the war. There are bad things in the war. It's kind of like World War II in 1943. In the middle of it. You go either way. The war isn't going to end soon. There will be good things, bad things. In the middle of a world war on whose outcome rests the survival of our civilization. And this war will be a dominant part of your lives as you grow up and move out into the world. On to the demographics. I hate to tell you this, Europe is dying. Now, obviously, you can reverse low birth rates. You can't do it quickly. You know, a Congress or a parliament can change the tax rate overnight. You can't change the birth rate overnight. The birth rates in Europe are now so low that to get back to the 2.1 replacement level will take 2 generations. In other words, you need a bigger generation to have a bigger generation. That's 40 to 50 years from whenever they start, and they haven't started yet. Some countries are at least alert to the problem. France has the highest birth rate in Europe. It's still below the replacement level. It's 1.8, including the Muslims, but it's still the highest. The French government has decided that the woman most likely to have a child is someone who was already the mother of 2. In other words, the mother of 2 is more likely to have a third than is a 32-year-old single career girl likely to have a first. So if you are the mother of 2 and you're willing to have a third, the French government will pay you $3,000 a month for 18 years to raise them. It's actually not a bad career, okay? In England, they don't get it. The Journal of the British Medical Association has now published an editorial. This is the magazine that goes to every practicing physician in the UK. They published an editorial urging doctors to discourage women patients from having children because of the Earth's carbon footprint. Spain is in a demographic death spiral. So what do? They passed a law. It is now illegal in Spain to use the words mother and father on a birth certificate. They're sexist. The official words on a Spanish birth certificate are progenitor A and progenitor B, and they're interchangeable. So mother or father could be either one. I don't think that's going to help. My favorite example is Russia. You know, Peter the Great once said Russia is a country in which things that just don't happen, happen. It's true. Putin is driving Russia into the same ditch the communists drove it into, and that's another conversation. But they do understand the demographics. The birth rate in Russia is so low now. The average lifespan of a man in Russia is under 58 years of age. The birth rate is so low, the population's plunging so fast, that by 2050, the population of Russia will be smaller than the population of Yemen, which has a very high birth rate. Now, Yemen's a little place. Russia covers nearly 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. So what do they do? 2 years ago, the governor of the province of Ulyanovsk issued a proclamation. From now on, September 12th of every year is officially the day of conception. Under the terms of the proclamation, on September 12th, all workers are given the afternoon off. I'm quoting the proclamation, with orders to go home and create a patriot for Russia. Only in Russia do they order this. The guy who's president of Russia, Medvedev, thinks, great idea. So now they're spreading this out from Ulyanovsk to all of Russia. Somebody got to Medvedev and must have said, he can't call this the day of conception. So they had to rename it. Russian PR is like not great. The official word for September 12th is the day of marital contact. Which strikes me as not a PR improvement. Here's a statistic we found out from Russia at the CIA, and we got to President Reagan, and I'll bet you haven't heard it. The average Russian woman has 8 abortions. Average 8, meaning half are having more than 8. Go ahead, have 9, 10, 11 abortions, then give birth. Mother and child have terrible health problems. It's a disaster. Last November 28th, just about when we were having Thanksgiving, in the city of Novorossiysk, nothing city, not far from the Black Sea, to everyone's astonishment, the mayor and the city council passed a resolution. They declared it the week of no abortions. They said, let's see if we can get through 1 week without an abortion. And they had advertisements on TV. They brought in counselors to talk women out of abortion. They ordered that pro-life movies be shown in all the schools. Can you imagine trying that around here or where I live? Can it? This is a nothing secular Russia. That's how bad things are. Here are the numbers. 2.1 is the replacement level of birth rates. Demographers tell us 1.3 is the suicide rate, the rate from which a society cannot recover its population. There's no example of a country whose birth rate dropped to 1.3 that ever got back up. Today on the European continent, there are now 17 countries whose birth rates are at or below 1.3. And so is Japan. Canada's 1.5. They want immigrants. Canada wants brains. In the last 20 years, most of the immigrants to Canada have been ethnic Chinese. Good for the collective Canadian IQ, terrific for eating out in Vancouver. Canada says in the next 20 years, most of the immigrants will be from the Indian subcontinent. Here's what will happen in the United States. Unless something changes radically, and I don't think it will, in the next 25 to 30 years, we're going to bring between 60 and 70 million immigrants into the United States. That's the number we need to keep the machine going. That's why that number keeps coming up. That's a 25% increase in our population. Obviously, they'll be mostly, but not entirely, Hispanic. The political question, and it will dominate your lives, is how do you want to do this? Traditionally, we've been a melting pot. Bring your food, bring your music, leave everything else in the old country, just be an American. Increasingly, we're taking the European approach. Remember the technical definition of multiculturalism. People of different faiths and cultures are permitted to settle without being required to assimilate. That's going to be the political fight you're dealing with. Here's what the U.S. economy will look like as we come out of the recession. It's going to look like a hamburger, and a very fat hamburger bun. The bottom half of that hamburger bun is 60 to 70 million immigrants. Look, good people, working hard, paying taxes. even if we solve all the amnesty problems, it's a lot of immigrants very fast, puts a huge strain on local and state government, social services, healthcare, education. It just does. The top half of that hamburger bun are the baby boomers in our 60s, starting to step aside and take out of the system. And this generation of baby boomers, we are not going gently into the good night. We'll go bankrupt here, as you can see watching television every night. The hamburger in the middle is you. That's the productive economy. What happens is this. As your birth rates drop, you put a crushing tax burden on younger people to support the older people or the immigrants at the bottom. And when you put a crushing tax burden on young people, you can't afford to get married. Well, you get married later. You can't afford a big house. You have a small apartment. You can't have a lot of kids. And the whole birth rate spirals down. We used to have 16 workers in this country for every American on Social Security. Do you know how many we have now? 3. When it goes to 2, which it will when you're about 30, it's over. That's what's happening in Europe. That's what's happening in Japan. That's what you're up against. This is math, not politics. So the demographics are very worrisome. Last point. Never have so many human beings emerged so quickly from poverty. Now, this is great. This is the most optimistic, wonderful news in the world. But there's a problem. You bring 3, 4, 5 billion people out of poverty, and the air's filthy, we're choking on it, you can't drink the water, it's polluted, that's a disaster. But the one thing we cannot say to these people is no. Sorry, too late, I've got a big house, 2 SUVs, you can't. That's inhuman. It's inhuman. The fortunes will be made by those companies that can develop products that are clever, inexpensive, and green. And that's why you're hearing them. This is no longer an environmental issue. This is now the core driving issue of global business. We know how to bring the world out of poverty. We just want to do it without trashing the planet. I can't imagine a more interesting problem to have, and you're going to have to solve it. It's not a government program. It's 100 million solutions. E-books. You know, if you want to buy one of my books, that's great. I cut down a tree to make it. I burn fuel shipping it to you. But if you buy the e-book, you get the same knowledge, no environmental damage, fraction of the cost. Clever, inexpensive, green. All over the world now, companies are trying to invent products and services that are clever, inexpensive, and green. And you're going to have to figure this out. Look, this is the most interesting problem any generation has had in world history. We are that close to bringing the world out of poverty, and we want to do it without trashing the planet. Get ahead, figure it out. And by the way, those are your jobs. This is a fun problem. This is fun. This is exciting. The 2 countries leading the way are India and China. Things are changing very fast. China's in a lot of trouble. What they've accomplished is extraordinary. But the place is still run by a bunch of commies. And that's not a great government structure for the 21st century. They shoot dissidents. They build schools out of unreinforced concrete. When there's an earthquake, all the schools collapse, kill the kids. They cheat. Please don't tell me the girls on the Olympic gymnastics team were 15. You know, if they're going to cheat on that, they're going to cheat on trade, arms control. They've got to deal with that. They have a more serious problem. China has a critical shortage of professional managers, people with MBA types. They're aware of it, but they're just falling further behind. They can't fix it fast enough. So projects are slowing down, things are going haywire. It's the third problem that I think ends it. You've heard that China has a 1-child per family policy? You realize what that means, by the way, is all the schools that collapsed, every child killed is an only child. Makes the catastrophe even worse. With the 1-child per family policy, the birth rate in China is 1.1. China is now the most rapidly aging country in the world. Japan had the good sense to get rich before it got old. China's doing it the other way around. Doesn't work. Do the math. Within your lifetime, the population of China will drop by 35%. About to go right off a cliff. Remember, the birth rate's lower than in Italy and Spain. And the suicide rate's 1.3. China's at 1.1. Keep your eye on India. India's coming up fast on the outside. Birth rate's 2.8. They speak English. They've got the rule of law. It's a democracy. My guess is India's going to blow past China and be the real star of it all. Now, we wish them both well. These are marvelous, wonderful countries, great people. I hope they all come out of poverty, and I hope they're all customers for the goods and services we can sell, and we'll buy stuff from them. And we'll have these gigantic middle classes. And whatever problems we have, let the diplomats settle it out. I don't want a war with anybody. We're all in this together, giant middle classes. China and India share a problem. And it's kind of icky, so it doesn't get talked about much in polite company, but I think you need to be aware of it, so I'm going to talk about it. Back to the demographics. Before I give you the demographics, give you a short lesson in biology. When we have children, you get 103 boys for every 100 girls. That's the human ratio. It's not Republican versus Democrat or American versus Oriental. The human ratio is 103 boys are born for every 100 girls. Today we have the technology to know which is which. Virtually everywhere in the world now, expectant parents know the sex of an unborn child unless they said they don't want to be told. In India and China, there's a cultural preference for boys. So they're aborting the girls. So many that in India and China, instead of having the normal human ratio of 103 boys to every 100 girls, the ratio is 118 boys for every 100 girls. In some provinces of both countries, the ratio is now 130 boys for every 100 girls. And there's a province of China that just reported a ratio of 192 boys for every 100 girls. What this means in real numbers is that right now, in these countries, there are more than 100 million boys growing up who will never find wives. It's unprecedented in world history, and let me tell you something. The single most destabilizing force in the world is a bunch of unmarried men. Unmarried women don't cause trouble. Unmarried men do. India and China are in panic mode. Both governments have now made it a crime for an obstetrician to disclose the sex of an unborn child. The government of China says by 2050 the population gap in China will be over 200 million. The thought of 200 million single guys descending on Shanghai and Beijing on Friday nights is an absolute nightmare. Take some real nasty bounces. You all watch the Olympics in Beijing? Here's what they didn't tell you. What they do now, there's a shortage of wives. They load up 747s on Friday nights in Shanghai, Beijing, there are other cities. They fly them over to Saigon, sorry, Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And these companies arrange receptions at the hotels with all the Vietnamese single girls. Chinese men are sweeping across Vietnam into Laos and Cambodia and bringing back wives. They're arranging the courtships, the immigration, the marriages. The social mess this is causing as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia are basically losing all their single people. And they're going to, it's a disaster. They got the same problem in India. Wife shortage, different solution. In India, if you're one of the men lucky enough to have a wife, you can rent her to someone who doesn't. Cultural sensitivity. On average, it's $175 a month for 3 months. The average income is $22 a month. That's real money. India has a woman president now. In their system, the prime minister is the head of the government, the president's the head of state, she's the head of state. She's very competent, extraordinary woman. She says, now that they've made it a crime for an obstetrician to disclose the sex of an unborn child, more girls are being born, and that was the idea. According to the president of India, each day, more than 7,000 newborn girls are being murdered by their parents. So what they've done is they've set up a network of facilities, kind of drop-off points. If you've given birth to a daughter and you don't want her, don't kill her, drop her off. Sort of like FedEx drop-off points. And India is setting up a whole network of facilities. They're not actually orphanages because the parents aren't dead, but they're the same thing, to raise the unwanted girls in hopes of fixing that ratio. Now, we wish India and China well, but I've noticed more and more in the last few months people talking about the Indian and Chinese models and something we Americans should perhaps adopt for the 21st century. No thanks. Now, in the last bit of time here, we've made several orbits around the planet, and you've been very patient. I wanted to cover a lot of territory. Here's what it means. This is the world you're walking into. This is what's going on out there. There is only one purpose to knowing what the future is, and that's so you can change the future before it happens. That's the whole point of knowing the future. What makes we human beings different from all the other species is we can project the future and then change it. What I've tried to do this evening is give you a sense of what's going on out there, the world you're going to be walking into, for those of you who are students. What do you want to do? What policies do you think we should adopt? How would you like to live your lives? Honorable people can disagree about these things, and that's fine. First, we have to have an understanding of what's going on, then we can argue about it. What I've tried to do is set the stage for you so that over the next few days, few weeks, few years, you can decide what you'd like the future to be. And is it going there? And if there's a gap, how do you want to fix it? As people campaign for office, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, libertarians, green, are they talking about this? Is what they're saying related to this? Does it suit what you think is best? This is the task before you, to understand the world, to see what the future is going to be, and if you don't like it, change the future before it happens. That's the whole point of an intelligence brief. I'll leave you with one piece of advice, and this is something we learned from President Reagan. Be an optimist. It's easier to get up in the morning, it's a lot more fun. But much more importantly, it's the optimists who solve the problems. Pessimists can define a problem, they can talk it to death. It's the optimists who get up in the morning, go into their shops, their offices, their factories, their universities, and they come up with solutions. They figure out what to do. Jerry Ford, your great president, is an optimist. I was lucky, I got to meet him a few times. He's a neat guy, I always figured the future would work out okay. He's very American, probably the most American president we've ever had, in the sense of, got it. This is a man who says, we're Americans, we fix the future. So despite all the problems, I'm an optimist. You're Americans. I hope you'll also be optimists. And thank you. I think we can take some questions.
Your evaluation of the performance of the CIA during the past 10 years, please.
Ghastly. It's been terrible. So we could spend all evening and several years on this, but it just isn't the kind of intelligence service adequate to what we need. What we should have done after 9/11 is build an intelligence service on the World War II model, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. That was a much more effective model of an intelligence service. That's what we did in the Reagan years. And instead we built one that kind of looks like the United Airlines. Big, it's funky, it just doesn't have the speed, smarts. So it's not a very good intelligence service. Wonderful people, by the way, work very hard to keep us safe. We owe them all gratitude. But it's not the right model. And that's why it's slipping on by that.
Question? Would you answer this? I was wondering if it isn't a real problem for the modern Muslim who would like to become part of society. They have no leader. Whereas, you know, the Catholic Church has the Pope, we have our leaders. The modern Muslim world does not have a leader.
Well, you've gone right to the heart of it. Here's what's happening.
Please repeat the question.
The great question, does the moderate Muslim have a leader to turn to? Who's out there? Very good question. What you're seeing is this. For several centuries now, there's been a civil war within Islam. Think of it as the moderates versus the radicals, okay? Never get in the middle of somebody else's civil war. It's like getting in the middle of your neighbor's marriage problem. They will not appreciate your interference. But if you're sitting in the living room and a bullet comes through the window, suddenly it's your business, okay? So we had to get in the middle of their civil war because they attacked us. You do have a lot of moderate Muslims. Your average human being is moderate. Your average mom doesn't want to see a kid become a suicide bomber. The trouble is the moderates have been very quiet. And the reason is, in that part of the world, you open your mouth, they kill you. What is changing now is for the first time, the moderates may be getting the upper hand in some places. And that's what's encouraging. Now the trouble is, our media doesn't report this. You know, airplane lands safely is not a headline. So as soon as the news started getting better, as soon as moderate Muslims started speaking up, when the electricity got turned back on, when the Baghdad School of Music and Ballet reopened, suddenly everything dropped out of the headlines. So in fact, there are moderate leaders emerging. And it's a very good sign. And by the way, politically, the elections that they just had in Iraq a few weeks ago were better organized and more honestly counted than anything we'll see in Chicago for another 50 years. No, literally. Okay, 60 years. No, quite literally. And in my opinion, these guys, they kind of came over as not very pleasant types. They're actually turning into very skillful politicians, and I mean in the best sense of the word, building coalitions, which is a whole new thing in that part of the world. So the moderates are there, but moderates tend to be quiet. They're home. They're raising their kids. They're doing their job. It's the loudmouths who cause all the trouble. So they're there. The pity is our media isn't highlighting them and telling us about it. So you get a false impression. But yeah, what we want to do is back the moderates so they defeat the radicals, and then they'll have more violence. That's the idea. Honorable people can disagree over how to do it, but that's the idea.
With respect to your comments about Pakistan and the destabilization of Pakistan, what did you
hang on, I'll get the mic.
With respect to your comments about the destabilization of Pakistan and the threat that's posed by that destabilization, what do you think, if any, is India's interest in that destabilization, or what action would India be prepared to take or not take if that continues?
India is absolutely terrified. You have a failing nuclear state next door, and they've got dozens of nuclear weapons, and there are missiles all pointed at India. India is absolutely scared. I mean, rightly so, just as we'd be scared that Mexico had nuclear bombs. So everybody's trying to figure out how to pull this thing together. Nobody has a good idea. Okay, there isn't a good idea. It's falling apart. So, it's a nightmare. It wouldn't surprise me if you wake up one morning and there's been a military coup in Pakistan. Everybody will denounce it, and privately everybody will be a little bit relieved. So maybe they can get a better grip on it. Nobody knows. I mean, this is absolutely terrifying. It's a nuclear superpower coming unglued. That's what's happening. And the president's got a very generous hand, so it's a scare step. But the next door, not meaning nuclear bombs that could fall in Al-Qaeda. It doesn't get more scary, and because units of the Pakistani army and intelligence service are working with Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda, you can't get a grip on where the nukes are and who's not, or who's not. We'll go with that, so we ain't got it.
As well. With the ever-prevalent multiculturalism with the Islamic community and their persistence to stay isolated, before the world becomes at least a semi-harmonious global entity, do you foresee another major attack by their community upon the civilized world, or is the one that we've experienced within the last decade maybe the last?
You can safely assume that while we're sitting here talking tonight, there are people planning an act. And that's a given. Now, I remember the Cold War years. Everybody said, you're not going to get to the Cold War without another nuclear bomb going on. Please don't tell me Hiroshima was the only one. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's got to be another nuclear bomb. Well, it wasn't. Now, the Cold War went on for 40, 50, 60 years. There's no other nuclear war. So, it happened. Maybe there won't be another attack. Maybe. But they're lying. I mean, I'm sorry to keep giving you these non-answers, but we're in the middle of a global struggle, and you're up against people who will still get hurt or nuclear. And as I keep saying, honorable people can disagree about what to do. First thing is you recognize what the problem is. Then you go argue about it. What worries you the most is you get a lot of people who won't accept the fact that you're in the middle of a clash of civilization. And as I say, people who disagree about how to fight it, and that's fine. But we got a problem. So, all the experts will tell you, sure you can be another attack. But I also remember all the experts saying, there's going to be another nuclear exchange. There wasn't. Maybe we'll catch it right. Okay.
Am I correct in saying that the alliance between the United States and Western European powers, and now some Eastern European states, has been in the past the stabilizing force for the modern world. You mentioned that Western European politicians are concerned about the Muslim vote. The Muslim population is increasing in Europe significantly. Is this alliance that we have had with Western powers in danger because of a growing Muslim population and a different political outlook in Europe and a lessening population?
Yes. You got it exactly right. Yeah. Basically, the gap between Europe and the United States is wide. By the way, the new word for Europe is Reagan. That's the new word. That's the call. The answer is yes. The young people in Europe are Muslim. We just look at the numbers. Well, where's your army? And I gotta go fight. Because what Europe wants to do, and I'm generalizing obviously, but what they want to do is they wish to grow old gracefully. Boy, the Europeans know how to be graceful. They're really good at it. They know what's right. They're not raising a generation. All that birth rates are either at or below the suicide level. So they just want to be comfortable. And then you get somebody like George W. Bush who was over there and said, look, I'll fight the enemy. You're crazy. No, I said you got rid of the cultural gap. Not just Bush's mannerism and all that, the cultural gap. So the answer is, yeah, Europe wishes to be left alone to live out its years to come.
If that then is no longer the power center,
then who's the power center?
Then who do we align with to have a power center to protect the modern world?
What everybody talked about through the Bush years, and you didn't hear this through all the noise, is what he used to call the coalition of the willing. Another word for it was the Anglosphere. What it meant was, who wants to help? It was the United States, to some extent England, Canada, Australia definitely, India definitely, Poland. So you put together a new coalition of basically Western civilization. Countries that had the energy and the will to defend Western civilization. And that's what you were getting. Now, we've kind of thrown the Poles overboard with the missile defense thing. We've kind of pushed away from that when the president canceled the missile defense thing. So they basically told the Poles, you're on your own path. The question is, what do you do if the United States jumps out? What you're seeing right now is the whole world holding its breath to see whether the United States will lead the world. Now, I don't need to make this political, I'm just reporting to you. Everybody moans and groans about the United States. But when the world gets in trouble, I mean big trouble, who do they turn to pull them out? Us. Sweaty, hairy, tested, Bible pumping, knuckle dragging, gun-toting morons. We rescue everybody. And by the way, we're more Nobel Prize than every other. You're not allowed to say it. Nobel Prize for literature. We do that. Well, what do you do if we're not there? Who do you get a call to help? France. And the whole world right now is totally trust you. What do you Americans do? That's what we're here. That's what we're here.
I have a question. During your listing of during your listing of all of the countries, Islamic or Christian or Jewish, you did not mention Saudi Arabia. And Bin Laden, of course, is a Saudi. The numbers of people that performed 9/11 catastrophe were Saudi. The government saw that the Bin Ladens and other Sauds of higher rank were flown back to Saudi Arabia when there was the no-fly period.
Yeah.
It's quite a known fact that wealthy Sauds are funding Al-Qaeda. What is your comment about this, and why have we stood silent on this issue?
I agree with you. Saudi Arabia is not our ally, it is our enemy. And our failure to recognize that and act on that has been a catastrophe. Absolutely right. Now, to some extent, we've been stuck because we need their oil. But everything you look at in Saudi Arabia says this is not your friend, this is your enemy. Now, there's some indications in just the last few months that they're getting scared. Good, get scared. Maybe they'll flip. But you're absolutely right, and I don't have any explanation other than we needed their oil of why we did not treat them that way, because everything they did was hurting us rather than helping us. Everything you said is correct. Now, you know, you're right. Yeah.
Aside from the stock market going into convulsions, what kind of escalation do you see happening if Israel attacks Iran?
Oh, no, that's an interesting question. We were chatting about this at lunch. I'll tell you an interesting story that may give us a clue. And then we're into it. Everybody forgets this. But back in the late 70s and early 80s, Saddam Hussein in Iraq was building a nuclear bomb. It's amazing how everybody forgets this. They were building the Osirak nuclear reactor right outside Baghdad, and that was going to produce the plutonium for Saddam Hussein's nuclear bomb. He would have had by 83, 84 at the latest, and everybody was terrified. Osirak was being built by our good friends and great allies, the French and Europe, and they wouldn't stop. There was a hell of a lot of Iraqi oil money sloshing around the Harrison bomb. Saddam Hussein had bought every politician in France and Europe. The Prime Minister of Israel then was Menachem Begin. And Begin was a tough little guy. Begin took one look at this and he said, no, this is an existential threat to the existence of the state. And that's when Begin gave the orders to the Israeli Air Force, take out Osirak. This is one of my favorite stories of the time. The Israelis were going to use 6 fighter bombers to do it. It's a long way from Israel to Baghdad and back. And when you're flying an Israeli fighter bomber, there's nowhere to land and refuel. Not in that neighborhood. You can't drop down to the gas station outside Tehran, give your Israeli pilot a Visa card, say, fill the tank and do the windshield. You got to make it back. So they welded extra fuel tanks under the wings. Even with the extra tanks, the calculation was they're not going to get back all 6 planes. So if nothing went wrong, you weren't going to make it, okay? 6 volunteer pilots who said they would fly it. And this looked like a one-way mission to the existence of the state. And they trained for the mission. The Israelis do a better job of training for specific missions than anybody, probably because they've had more practice. One of the things they trained for was flying wingtip to wingtip. Not a figure of speech, I mean flying wingtip to wingtip. When you take off from a runway in Israel, when you clear the runway, you're out of Israeli airspace. It's not like taking off from here in Chicago. You're still in the United States. Over there, you clear the runway, you're over another country. Well, these guys took off from their base, and they're over Jordan. You got to go over Jordan to get to Baghdad. This is a long answer to your question. You got to go over Jordan to get to Baghdad. What happened was, because of the way they were flying wingtip to wingtip, wingtip to wingtip, when the Jordanian air traffic controller who was on duty that day picked them up on his radar screen, he saw one wall. So he came on the air, he said, excuse me, you a 747? To which the lead pilot replied, yeah, we are. And he cleared it through. That's how they did it. This air traffic controller is no longer with them. They took down here, like all 6 pilots, when they landed, the tanks were down. I have no idea how they did that. It was either the greatest flying 6 guys ever did or more, but they actually, they did it. Tanks were empty, all the dials were empty, they landed. Interesting side, like one of the 6 pilots was Ilya Ramon. He's the Israeli astronaut who went down the space shuttle disaster in 2003. And actually, he survived the Baghdad mission, he doesn't the space shuttle. Anyway, the Iranians aren't stupid. They know what happened. They dispersed their nuclear facilities. There are 15, 18, 20 sites around the country. The Israeli Air Force is different. They can hit it, but they can't kill the nuclear program. They don't have airplanes. Not only are these sites underground, they're under 15 feet of concrete. That's hard. You really got to hit these things. That's why the Israelis have asked us for help. They could use a little help knocking out the Iranian nuclear facilities, and we said no. The shortcut to Iran is over Iraq, if you look at a map. And we control Iraqi air don't know what's going to happen. And I'll tell you one thing that's really funny. When the Israelis hit the Osiris site in Iraq, the United Nations went to the survey. Everybody was denouncing the Israelis, the United States. Said we were listening to their private conversations. And what the Arab government was saying privately was, boy, that's a relief, isn't it? And it was right. We were passing these notes to Jean Kirkpatrick at the UN while she was listening to these guys blow the roof off. But we knew what they were saying privately. Same thing's happening again. The Saudis have actually passed word to the Israelis. If you want to go hit the Iranians, it's perfectly okay with us. They wouldn't mind a bit. They're scared stiff with these guys. So that's kind of what you're up against. The question is, what's the retaliation? What happens next? Here's the way it's playing out in Israel. The Israelis are not worried that Egypt launches its army across the Sinai and has stop it. They're not worried that Syria launches its tanks up to the Golan Heights. The Israelis can stop the tanks on the Golan Heights. They control the firing down. What the Israelis cannot survive is about 75 or 80,000 of these rockets raining in on Israel. These Katyusha rockets, these Qassam rockets that you see in Israel. They're all around Israel. Hezbollah has put them in Lebanon. Hamas put them in Gaza. Hezbollah and Hamas are subsidiaries of Iran. Iran owns them. The reason they put in these tens of thousands of rockets is precisely to stop the Israelis from launching an attack. You hit the nuclear sites, you send them these 75,000 crummy rockets to the Iraq. That's the whole thing. Now, 2 years ago, Israel went into Lebanon and they pushed everything back. If you remember, in January, they went into Gaza. They pushed everything back. They went into Gaza in January because President Bush knew he would stop it. The Gaza operation ended on inauguration, and there were no coincidences. It looks to me like the Israelis are clearing the ground for an attack. If they can push the rockets back far enough so they're not a threat, they can hit you. As I say, everybody I know tells me it's going to happen. I'm more skeptical than that. That's where we are. So you're looking at a war that's getting nastier rather than quiet. There are some good things happening. Don't be discouraged, but there are also some bad things. And what I've tried to do is just give you a sense of this. Now look, there's a single one of you in this room who knows what I think we should do. And that's fine. My opinions don't matter. I've left my opinions out of this, and for that purpose. Understand the problem. Then start an argument over what do you want to do with that? And remember, honorable people can disagree. But don't get into the habit that we people have gotten into, the older people, arguing before we understand. Don't let it become a shouting match. The greatest strength we have, we can think our way through. And if you remember that and just get into a conversation, not an argument, and understand it before you start yelling and screaming, we'll be fine. And with that, I better get out of your way, and thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Grand Valley State University. Visit us at gvsu.edu.